So, as it has been said, I'm going to talk about biomechanics. That's right. So I prepared this presentation and I divided it into two parts after a short introduction of what is medical device sector. The first one is going to be dedicated to some simulation done with some Transvalor software solutions, mainly for the manufacturing process of medical devices. And then I'm going to switch on my own research activity for biomedical simulations. And then I will conclude. So medical devices are obviously subjected to very strict directives and regulations. And up to now, they were divided into different classes, from class 1, that you can see here, for the low-risk medical device, up to class number 3, which corresponds to the highest risk medical devices. All implantable devices are owned to this third class. Of course, the compliance procedure takes long time. It's easy in this case, and it's more and more complex when you go up to the third class. And the finite element modeling can be of help in order to anticipate manufacturing defects and to shorten the compliance procedures. So if we look at the literature, in the medtech sector, there are several kinds of simulation that are well presented. For instance, in the manufacturing process, mainly for medical devices made of metals and polymers. But we can see also some biomedical simulations when you deal with skeleton or bones that you would like to test in use conditions. But you can also have some multiphysics simulations for human body applications, for instance. If you want to develop a heart valve, it is important to have fluid, also to take into account the fluid in interaction. So the series of benefits that we have using finite element modeling are more or less the same as for the other kind of industrial sectors, mainly to accelerate the product development cycle and to reduce the number and the cost of physical trials. So the main aim is to boost engineering for more innovative medical devices. So if we look at the Transvalor software portfolio, they offer a large range of applications dedicated to the medtech sector, starting from forging or casting of prostheses. We have also some injection modeling for polymer medical devices. And also, they have performed some structural analysis to see how the components behave under in-use conditions. So, if we focus more on the forging field, you can see that using Forge software, we are able to model the complete forming sequence. This is for the hip stem made in titanium, with the first stage here corresponding to the section reduction, the second stage corresponding to the bending to get the preform, and the final stage that corresponds to the forging part, forging stage, in order to get the right shape at the end. Casting, and more specifically investment casting, is also widely used for medical products. You have an example here of a knee joint that has been casted. And the recent development in Thercast allow to do good simulation in this area. They have now hollow shell generation that can be useful, but also self-radiation capability. And as you can see, there is a huge impact of the self-radiation, if you take it into account or not, on the evolution of the texture of the material. So it's very important to be able to take into account this phenomenon. Regarding the plastic injection molding, you can use REM3D, for instance, to be able to detect the welding lines in that part, for example, or also to monitor the pressure profile during inside the mold during the filling, the packing, and the holding phase. And as it has been already mentioned, you have here a very short video about the compression expansion cycle of a stent. The stent made of nitinol. This is a high performance memory shape alloy that is used, and thanks to Forge, we are able to optimize the stent design and helps to create a product that fulfills all the technical requirements, you can look at the evolution of the pressure onto the artery wall during the expansion phase of the stent. So now I'm going to focus on my own topic. It has been divided, in fact, in two different axes. One is dedicated to the characterization of materials, and including biological materials. Biological materials are awful materials. Most of them are heterogeneous, hyperelastic, and isotropic, so the worst, I think, in the world. We have wide scattering of the parameters in the literature, so when you would like to perform a simulation, it's very difficult to know which of the parameters you have to take. They are also very sensitive to the environment, so it's a huge problem for us. So we generally have to develop our own specific device to make the mechanical characterization of these materials. And often we are performing identification of the materials parameter using inverse analysis, which is particularly suitable for this field. The other axis of my research is the numerical modeling of biological materials, so the same that I have characterized here. Here again, we have specific features that required to develop specific solvers. I mainly work with Forge, so we developed an hyperelastic solver to be able to reproduce the mechanical properties of those biological materials. This is inside the laboratory version of Forge. And we have also to deal with complex geometries. This means that generally CAD systems are not sufficient to be able to reproduce the geometries of the organs or the tissues we are working on. So there are two main applications for the numerical modeling. The first one is the computer-aided design of medical devices. I worked on breast implants, heart valves, cochlear implants, and so on. And the subject I decided to show you today belongs to the second part, the second axis for the numerical modeling application, which is a computer-assisted surgery. So I work with a lot of surgeons, and the work that I'm going to present was carried out by a maxillofacial surgeon, Charles Savoldelli, who is a maxillofacial surgeon in Nice. And he was interested in such topics. In fact, what you can see here on these pictures, this is not extra teeth. There are teeth that were not allowed to grow normally because the mandible of the subject was too short. Okay? So the classical treatment before was to remove these teeth, and this is not something that the surgeons like to do because they don't like to remove healthy materials, healthy organs or tissues. So some surgeons propose new alternatives, and the one that I'm going to present is the one which is called DOG. It stands for distraction osteogenesis, and it was proposed by Guerrero in 1997. So this is a surgical process which was mainly used in the field of orthopedics, mainly to reconstruct skeletal deformities or to lengthen the bones in the body. Especially for the lower limbs, it was used for that. And early results in humans indicated that the process can be used for the maxillofacial surgery. So I had a movie to show it, but there is too much blood, I think, for the audience. So I decided just to mention this using this scheme here. The way it is performed by the surgeon, they are cutting the mandible into two segments, and the two segments are gradually separated by a tool which is called a distractor that can be put directly on the teeth or on the bone, and you have a small screw that you have to turn, and if you turn it correctly in the morning, 1 millimeter per day, this means that after 10 days, you have increased your mandible of about 1 centimeter. So this is quite impressive. When the desired or the possible length is reached, it is followed by a consolidation phase in which the bone is allowed to keep healing. The big advantage of DOG, the distraction osteogenesis, is that it simultaneously increases the bone length and the volume of the surrounding tissues, soft tissues. So this is very interesting. So you can see the result after a few weeks of the surgical operations, and then using classical orthodontic treatment, they can put the teeth into their right position. So this is the final result. Of course, they remove after all the distractors. So there are many clinical studies that have evaluated the long-term effect of this procedure in SIB, that no patient presented what we call the temporomandibular joint. This is the disc that you have here in your joint. So no symptoms, no dysfunction, but some of them have some pain. So the surgeon tried to understand why it is painful, and the small changes in the position of the condyles is the upper part of the mandible, were observed during the DOG, and it could lead to chronic pain. So the bone movements must be carefully planned before a device is implanted. So you don't have many possibilities to check this. You can put a sensor inside the temporomandibular joint, but of course it's going to modify the way people are showing, so it's not possible. And the choice that we have made is, of course, to use finite element modeling to check this. So at the beginning of the study, it is not the last study we have performed on this topic, but I think it was one of the most iconic ones, just to explain what we have done. So this is what we had at the beginning of the PhD in the literature, when we made the literature survey. As you can see, we have some courses, meshes. Most of the study does not model the teeth, which is of importance for us. Most of them were modeling only one half of the mandible, and then this is for stabilization reason, of course, for the computation. So this means that we are not satisfied with the available finite element model. So we decided to develop our own full 3D finite element model, capable of simulating the entire process of the DOG. So for having the geometries of the different organs or tissues of interest, we used CT scans and MRI images. So the CT scans were for the skull, for the bone, the hard tissues, and we use MRI for the soft tissues. For instance, you can see here the disc of the temporomandibular joint. This has been made thanks to a segmentation software, which means that layer by layer, we have to control the organ of interest, the tissue of interest, and it was a very long process. It took several weeks to get the final model that was interesting for our experiment. Okay, as you can see here, it was done layer by layer. Of course, we use X-ray. We use CT scans at the hospital. It was on a LC patient, so we were limited in terms of X-ray. And then this is the final result that we had after the segmentation, and we had to smooth a little bit the different tissues to be able to import them inside our finite element model. So you have here the result of the final finite element model. So it takes into account the articular disc, what we call the capsule joint, okay, the connectivity tissues, the skull, of course, itself, then the cortical and the cancellous bone. We have two kinds of bones in the body, and the maxillary and the mandibular teeth. As you can see, so it's almost 400,000 tetrahedral elements. And this model respects the natural asymmetry of the patient. For the mechanical properties, we consider for most of the tissues homogeneous and isotropic materials. For hard tissues, namely the bone, we use a linear elastic model. And for the soft tissues, we use the hyperelastic model that we have specially developed in our laboratory version of Forge, using what we call neo-Hookean model. For the friction properties, we use mainly sticking contact between the different, different tissues, except for the cartilage layer, for modeling the cartilage layer, in which we use a low friction contact between the disc and the bones. We model the muscles using force vectors, and we define the magnitude thanks to the physiological cross-section of the muscles. And we put the origin and the direction. It was taken from anatomical measurements. And we apply the same loading conditions on both sides. So you have here, where it should work. Okay, a simulation of the DOG simulation. Okay, There is no bone remodeling model inside Forge, so we had just to add at the end what we call a bone callus between the two different segments. And then we add to our model to shoe. So this is the jaw closer. You have before the operation and after the operation. So what is very interesting compared to a real patient is that we can do some cutting plane, not easy with patients. And we looked more specifically in the area of interest. So you have the disc here, also the condyles. And we looked at the von Mises stress distribution in those regions. This is another point of view of the skulls. And we focus more specifically on the disc, as you can see here, which enabled us, in fact, to get those kind of maps with von Mises stress maps. So what is interesting, so this is when you have the mouth which is open and closed at the end. You see the red levels which correspond to highest value of the von Mises stress. What you can see is that thanks to the natural asymmetry of the patient, we don't have exactly the same result for the right disc and for the left one. And when you close the jaw, you increase also the stress on the disc. What is also interesting is to compare before the surgical operation and after, and you see that the maximum level of von Mises stress is a bit higher after the operation than before. But it was not a huge difference. It was around lower than 2 megapascal. And these anatomical changes in the TMG structures are unlikely to predispose to long-term tissue fatigue. And it seems that it's more the rate or the frequency of the distraction that are probably more important than the amount of distraction. So at the end of this PhD, Charles Savolelli decided to ask his patient to turn the screw, remember that? It was 1 millimeter in the morning before the PhD, and after the PhD, it was 0.5 millimeter in the morning and 0.5 in the evening, and it seemed that it was less painful for the different patients. So, of course, we have a lot of limitations. We are still continuing to improve our model. We are still working on it. But the main information that we got from this study was that the present biomedical studies support the clinical theory that symphysial distraction generate a low risk of long-term temporomandibular joint dysfunction or condylar resorption. So for the conclusion, we have seen during this presentation that Transvalor provide the manufacturing industry with leading-edge simulation software for forging, casting, or plastic molding that could be very interesting for the manufacturing of medical devices. The major benefit is that it guarantees the product quality and increase the forming process reliability. And all these new applications are sustained by a constant research and development activity at Cemef. This is what I'm trying to do. And the Forge software on the presentation I gave was clearly used in a challenging, non-conventional way. But I think that it strengthens the robustness of the solver for the benefits of all users. I thank you for your attention. And if you have any question, I put here in this slide some other topics I worked on. If you have any question on this, I can also answer. Thank you.